Among the many anime directors out there, there are few that stick out to me quite as much as Mamoru Kanbei, for better or for worse. Admittedly, I have critiqued him severely in the past, but I still have a great deal of respect for him for actually having a distinctive style. And one of my favorite examples of how his directing choices reinforce the narratives he works with comes from Denpa Teki na Kanojo, or Electromagnetic Girlfriend, a mostly forgotten OVA from the mid-2000s that I still think about quite a lot, mostly because of Kanbei's influence on the project. Also, this should go without saying, but I'm about to spoil this entire series, so go watch it if you haven't already. It's only an hour and a half in total, and it's one of my favorite OVAs. Kanbei has a habit of being rather extreme with his cinematography, be it through rapid cutting or his liberal use of Dutch angles. But there's one technique in particular that he makes use of specifically in Denpa Teki that really grabbed my attention, in which he will superimpose one character on top of another during long stretches of conversation, rather than something more traditional like shot reverse shot. And based on the content and context of these conversations, the relative size and location of the characters in the frame have some rather interesting subtext to them. Let's take a look at the first time this is used, when Satsuki has drugged and beaten Juzawa and is monologuing about how she masterminded the serial murders in their town. During her explanation, she reveals that her neighbor, whose brute strength she directed towards the victims, had raped her while she was in middle school. As she elaborates on her neighbor's apparent mental instability, the frame captures Juzawa's face as he lies on the ground, but Satsuki's figure is superimposed on top of the frame during this section of dialogue. This, along with the fact that Juzawa's fate is completely controlled by Satsuki at this moment, leads me to believe that Kanbei is using this technique to convey control, or at least control over whatever conversation is occurring at the time. While Satsuki is describing something tragic and traumatic, her tone of voice and body language convey that she doesn't feel trapped or stifled by these events, but instead liberated, which is further reinforced by a text card that reads, "At that moment, one's true nature surfaces." And so she speaks openly about it and how she began to experience a sense of euphoria from watching people die. While you might initially think that Juzawa's close-up shot makes him more dominant in the frame, the fact that Satsuki is layered on top of him and still takes up roughly the same screen space, and even removes parts of Juzawa's space, makes her the more dominant figure, and so the shot has her as the one in control. A bit later in the conversation, we see this technique used again, but this time it's a medium shot of Juzawa superimposed on a close-up of Satsuki. Satsuki has given Juzawa an opportunity to speak before she kills him, and he uses this moment to challenge Satsuki's reasoning, saying that Satsuki could have been saved if she had asked for help rather than staying silent. Here, we see that Juzawa challenging Satsuki's defeatist beliefs has shifted control of the conversation over to him, forcing Satsuki to think deeper about her situation. Then, near the end of this shot, Juzawa shifts the focus onto himself, stating that he's not the great and fearless person Satsuki believes him to be, that he's actually weak, scared, and lonely underneath his delinquent facade. This causes Satsuki to panic, as her image of Juzawa is being shattered. And so we get the final superimposed shot of this episode, but with a radically different makeup. While Satsuki is the one being superimposed on Juzawa, Juzawa's face clearly dominates the frame in comparison to how small Satsuki is drawn. Satsuki is still trying to take control of the situation and hold on to her version of Juzawa, but Juzawa has already accepted the anxiety in his own heart, and, unlike Satsuki, decides to call out for help when he is in trouble, which allows Ochibana to jump in and save him. Juzawa's honesty trumps Satsuki's attempts to keep his facade together, and therefore it's Juzawa that controls the frame, despite Satsuki's attempts otherwise. The next major instance of this technique comes about halfway through episode 2. Juzawa and Ochibana have confronted Ayase and discover that she is the leader of the Happiness Club, a group that pulls malicious, often violent pranks on others in the hopes of, quote, gaining happiness points in order to enrich their own lives. When Ochibana tries to understand the logic behind Ayase's plan, we see a medium shot of Ochibana superimposed against a close-up of Ayase. Then, in the next shot, where Ochibana explains that her conclusion came from it being the most childish thing she could think of, the layering is reversed, with a medium shot of Ayase superimposed onto a close-up of Ochibana. It's also interesting that in both shots, Ochibana's and Ayase's bodies are oriented parallel to each other, indicating that Ochibana is trying to align her thinking with how she believes Ayase thinks in order to understand Ayase's reasoning. So, who has control in these shots? Well, let's take a look at the context of their conversation. Ochibana is on the offensive, trying to both understand and tear down Ayase's logic, while Ayase is on the defensive, forced to explain why she would commit such horrific acts. But in this scene, Ochibana's challenge doesn't really extend beyond "you are acting like a child." She doesn't try to refute Ayase's logic outside of insulting her, and so Ayase is able to maintain her position. And this seems to fall in line with what we've experienced with this technique so far. In the shot where Ochibana is layered over Ayase, Ochibana is inquisitive, merely seeking to understand Ayase, thus giving her the upper hand in the conversation. When we switch to the second shot, Ochibana's language shifts from inquisitive to confrontational, but because she fails to effectively dismantle Ayase's logic, Ayase remains in control at the end of the scene and is able to escape after trying to burn several people alive. This brings us to the final scene in which this technique is used, where Juzawa, Ochibana, and Shiraishi confront Ayase in her own home. Ayase tells them that there's no point in calling the police, as she hasn't left any evidence behind that could incriminate her, while Juzawa reveals to Shiraishi that Ayase was the one behind the pranks, and that she went by the name Kuraki when posting on the Happiness Club website, which seems to send Shiraishi into a panic. As this dialogue elapses, Ayase's figure is in the background, while Juzawa is superimposed on top, before being swapped out for Shiraishi, with all three figures being of relatively the same size. Here, the logic behind the character blocking seems to be that Juzawa and company are intruding on Ayase's space, thus making them the aggressors in this situation, but because Ayase thinks that she can't fail, she believes that she is in control, so the question of who is actually in control of the situation is left unanswered for the time being. The next instance comes when Ayase recounts the tragic story that Shiraishi had told Juzawa earlier in the episode, in which a boy who was in love with Shiraishi committed suicide in front of her. In this scene, it's revealed that the boy was Ayase's older brother, and we see Ayase's figure layered on top of a close-up of Shiraishi, thus making Ayase the dominant voice in the conversation and completely subduing Shiraishi. As for why she's able to do this, it's revealed that the reason her brother killed himself was because Shiraishi had been dating him at the time, but dumped him for someone more socially affluent, rather than it being an instance of unrequited love as Shiraishi had implied when she first told the story. And so Ayase, being the boy's sister, draws the guilt Shiraishi had suppressed back up to the surface, giving Ayase complete control over the conversation and completely shutting down any viable counter-arguments Shiraishi might make, which is reinforced by Ayase's figure being placed directly over Shiraishi's mouth. Shiraishi's helplessness is then amplified by two more instances of this technique. The first is when we see a medium shot of Shiraishi superimposed over a large close-up of Juzawa asking if this was true, conveying the guilt Shiraishi feels for misleading Juzawa earlier in the episode. The second instance comes after it's revealed that Ayase had been keeping her mother's corpse in her house, believing that the happiness points she'd been accumulating will help heal her mother, and so she backs Shiraishi into a corner with a knife, saying that she can gain even more points by dismembering Shiraishi's face and taking the points that she has. Here, Ayase's close-up completely dominates the wide shot of Shiraishi, pressuring her into dismembering herself as karmic punishment. It should also be noted that this is the first time a wide shot is used rather than a medium shot, thus making Shiraishi appear even more helpless before transitioning to a close-up of Shiraishi to convey the sheer terror on her face. Following this, we get one of my favorite shots from this series. Juzawa, with Ochibana behind him, is superimposed against the doorway leading to the corpse of Ayase's mother, with Juzawa and Ochibana splitting the frame down the middle. The background frame then fades back to Ayase tormenting Shiraishi, and we see Juzawa looking back and forth between these two scenes, conveying the anxiety and fear that the madness of this situation is causing him. That is until Ochibana leans down from the top of the frame and embraces him before it cuts away to a shot of just the two of them, where she reassures him that he is strong enough to survive this madness. The frame then cuts back to its previous position, this time showing both the mother's corpse and Ayase's tormenting, but instead of panic, Juzawa's face appears calmer, and as he breathes out to relax himself, the split frame fades away to a more ordinary background shot, conveying that Juzawa has found the mental fortitude to rise above the insanity around him. Following this, Ochibana approaches Ayase to address the logic of her happiness points once again. This time, however, Ochibana decides to go along with Ayase's logic rather than challenge it by pointing out that it was not Shiraishi who stole Ayase's happiness, but instead Ayase's brother, who we then learn was smiling and looked happy as he died for Shiraishi, thus implying that he was the happiest one there. Initially, Ochibana looms over Ayase and Shiraishi, signaling that she is taking control of the argument before switching to a smaller and more neutral pose. And the shot of Ayase and Shiraishi shifts to just a close-up of Shiraishi as she explains how Ayase's brother looked as he died. While the initial shot shows Ochibana taking control, the second shot seems to imply that the logic of Ayase's fantasy is solid enough for it to take control of the conversation, and so Ochibana backs off and allows the logic to play out naturally through Shiraishi. As Ayase realizes the truth and stops speaking, perhaps so as not to utter it herself, a close-up of Ochibana appears menacingly behind her as Ochibana explains it as clearly as possible. And this close-up then pushes Ayase towards the side of the frame, slowly edging her out. Though Ayase tries to fight against the shattered image of what she believed her reality to be, much like Satsuki in the previous episode, the truth Ochibana has revealed eventually takes full control. And so, even though Ayase is the one on the top layer, she is eventually pushed out of the frame completely, signifying Ochibana's victory. This technique of superimposing one character on top of another during heated discussions is one of many interesting cinematic ideas that I love about Denpa Teki no Kanojo. While it's not always used with the clearest intent, it is nonetheless something about this series that makes it one of my favorites and why I find Kanbei to be such a fascinating director. Special thanks to Rourketon Joing, Christine Seibert, Ryan Johnson, Devontae Leon, and all my other patrons for their generous support. My name is Ember, and I'll see you next time.